Hello, online participants. Thank you for bearing with us. And sorry for the late start, folks, but thank you all again for being here. Thanks to those of you online for being here. This talk is co-sponsored by the Center for Archival Futures, CAFE, which is a fairly new center still dedicated to thinking broadly about archives and digital care and dissemination of data over time. This talk is also co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Humanities, ARHU, and so we're really grateful to you all for co-hosting this and promoting this event with us, to have this rock star here with us. And also, of course, to the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, where we are physically sitting right now. We just had a really lovely time having some time between students and Dorothy Berry to talk. And we've got a full room here. So thank you all for having us and for hosting us here. Today we are beaming in from College Park, which is on the ancestral territories of the Piscataway, Nacotchtank, and their indigenous kin and neighbors. As members of the University of Maryland, we acknowledge as a land-grant university the 202,000 acres of stolen indigenous land distributed to the university under the Morrill Act in 1862. We want to acknowledge the separation that these and many other acts of colonialism, assimilation, and genocide, which included archival collecting, generated between indigenous peoples and their homelands. We honor the continued power and resilience of indigenous communities and nations, and celebrate the collaborative and decolonizing work now taking place in our collections and institutions, and not just during Native American Heritage Month, which starts today. We want to further acknowledge the University of Maryland's connection to slavery and to generations of racialized trauma rooted in the institution. As a member college of universities studying slavery, the University of Maryland has undertaken the 1856 Project, committed to investigating and illuminating these histories. The 1856 Project endeavors to lay a path forward for restorative history, allowing for the institution to engage in the work of moral accountability and reconciliation. Through this work, the University of Maryland recommits itself to creating equitable, inclusive, and diverse curricula, spaces, research, and so on. So I'm Diana Marsh. I'm an assistant professor in archives and digital curation here. And I've been a longtime fan of Dorothy Berry's work. So we're so excited that she is now the inaugural digital curator for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, NMAC, here in DC. She is recognized in many different ways by many different organizations, including by the Library Journal as a mover and shaker, and by the Society of American Archivists as an emerging leader in the Mark A. Green program. Dorothy Berry has established a reputation as a leading thinker around the discoverability of Black special collections and archives. Her work has primarily approached the question of discovery through the lens of archival description, digital collection development, and digital storytelling. And I know that's something that all of us here are equally committed to. Berry is an active member of the profession, serving on a wide range of advisory boards, and beyond digital collections and projects developed at various institutions that I'm sure many of you know about. Her published work can be found in Uproot, Lapham's Quarterly, JSTOR Daily, the Public Domain Review, and where she's also a contributing editor. So we are very excited to have Dorothy Berry here to present her talk, Subject Analysis, Centering Historical Lives in Contemporary Archives. Thank you again so much for being here.
So thanks everyone for coming out, and sorry that I'm not taller than a computer, and I never have been. My talk today, Subject Analysis, Centering Historical Lives in Contemporary Archives, is a personal one and a professional one. I am from a part of the country that alienates me. I am the type of person who left a small town, Ash Grove, Missouri, that they were always too much for, but I'm the descendant of people who chose to stay when almost every other Black family left for St. Louis or Kansas City or Chicago. This is a strange thing to say, but I am from a place where being Black is so rarefied that there are students and faculty whose whole work is studying my kin and their neighbors. My family has been a studied one in particular because we've tended to keep things. If I wasn't an archivist, I might say that I'm descended from archivists, but I'm really just descended from folks who wanted to keep what they had. This is why a few weeks ago, when I took a last-minute trip to Southwest Missouri to keep my mom company while my dad was in the hospital, I received an email from a professor at Missouri State University who's done amazing recovery work around Black history in the region. Apparently, last fall, my parents lent her and a student an old suitcase filled with decades of my grandmother's writings on legal pads, scrap papers, the backs of letters. The student, under the professor's guidance, had cataloged each distinct writing by first line, assigned them a topic or theme, genre, media. Each page was scanned and transcribed. I received a 257-page PDF. I didn't know my dad's mom very well, but I know that Wanda Berry, formerly Carlock, was loved in her community, her family, her AME congregation, and her neighbors. Seeing the scans of poems and letters, my immediate response was that they were personal. She published a small chapbook in the 80s, I think. So perhaps she would have been happy for her poems to be preserved, but the other materials like letters to family members seem like they shouldn't be shared for public consumption. As I said, and really do want to firmly establish, the professor who digitized this material and her research assistant are not the boogeymen of unethical collectors. When asked about their plans for future work on the collection, their response was clearly that they had no plans for further work and that this was perceived as a gift for my father and his siblings, and that while it did help contextualize some aspects of Black life in the region at a particular time, no part of the collection or conclusion drawn from it would be published without express consent of various family members. In preparing for this talk, however, this scenario presented a strong hypothetical. What if the suitcase was not passed on briefly between family and trusted researchers? What if somehow it had not ended up with family, and not in the garbage, but floating around some flea market, purchased by a professor, and then this anonymous collection of Black women's ephemera came into a university's archives? The intimacy of the poems disconnected from the personal understanding of this was my mom or this was my grandmother, and into the discourse around collecting more diverse materials and connecting with community, history from the bottom up. A poem scribbled on the corner of a letter from the Social Security office would become a charged piece, speaking to issues around Blackness, welfare, creativity, and poverty, but not necessarily speaking to anything about Wanda Berry. The issue of honoring the humanity of archival subjects is a complicated one and a simple one. Generally speaking, understanding the humanness and respecting the humanity of figures from the past or contemporary figures who will eventually be historical ones is a pretty fundamental element of modern historical studies. The complication comes into how we want to define honoring in our individual research, archival labor, and general thinking. I have my own perspective, which is always open to potential shifting, that I will share today, but want to acknowledge at the outset that just because I am asked to give a talk and can sound somewhat confident about my conclusions does not make them the only possible correct ones. I'm not a post-truth thinker in any way, but in these matters, I can only present the framework from which I try to approach my work, valuing historical subjects in archival contexts. 98 years and a day before I was born, Joseph E. Yoakum was born in Ash Grove, Missouri, or maybe Springfield, like his VA records show. Definitely not in Arizona, like he mythologized himself. His brother, Frank Fireball Yoakum, played one season for the Kansas City Monarchs in the Negro Leagues and passed away a bit over a week before Joseph's birthday in 1966. His obituary mentioned his brother in Chicago, while his tombstone, Frank's that is, only mentions his military service in World War I. His nephew, Lloyd Yoakum, lived in Ash Grove, Frank's son, until his death in 2001. I have memories of having memories of Lloyd, who along with my great uncle Lawrence, was one of the last vestiges of Black life in town. In the 1960s, Joseph began being known for his art, and beautiful and often fantastical landscapes and portraits. Out of nowhere, he was inspired in his early 70s and created over 2,000 drawings in the next decade of his life. Drawings that are now held in places like the MoMA, Guggenheim, etc. He told many origin stories about himself, about being a, quote, full-blooded Navajo, about being Black, about being nomadic since his childhood. The 2021 monograph, Joseph Yoakum, What I Saw There, has 3 essays that explore Yoakum biographically, and they all mention his parents, his disputed ethnic heritage, and the towns both of our kinfolk populated, Greenfield, Walnut Grove, and Ash Grove. None of them talk about the Black community in those towns, almost all related by blood or marriage. They talk about his itinerant early childhood and his return to the Ozarks in 1908, but don't mention that between his birth and that return, there were public lynchings in Monette, Pierce City, Joplin, and Springfield, Missouri, all within 60 miles of his family. The murder of his father, for which the white shooter was acquitted, is briefly mentioned. I called my dad yesterday and asked him what he remembered about the Yoakums. He said that he remembered Lloyd had an uncle who was a famous artist. My dad is still in the hospital and his breathing is a bit labored, his language a bit tired. He said that Lloyd had an uncle who was a famous artist, and then unprovoked said, quote, "The uncle was like a lot of people back then, a bit ashamed of being colored. And so he claimed to be Native American, even though no one else was so sure about that." He said Lloyd was a contemporary of his father and would come to visit my dad in the last years of his life, sitting on the front porch. My dad was not aware that their dad, John, and Lloyd's grandpa, had been shot by a white man in Walnut Grove, but who was from Ash Grove. But when I recounted the excerpt from the book about how there was a dog fight and then a disagreement that followed, he suddenly interrupted and said, "Oh, I know about the fight. I just didn't know he was shot by someone from Ash Grove." Then he retold a story I've heard a few times before, that once when he was little, maybe in the 1st grade, he was playing outside the Yoakum household and a big shiny new Dodge drove up. He said he must have been little because he wasn't too self-conscious to gape and go look inside the car. That car was Joseph Yoakum's. I told my dad that I had to go because I was writing a talk about archives and community and memory. He wouldn't let me go before sharing a story about the time Effie Yoakum had tried to learn to drive, eventually crashing because she took her hands off the wheel to wave at his grandma, Dorothy, and who then walked with a limp for the rest of her life. Community is a complicated and often in archives especially overused term. Should my dad, or even worse, I, have commenting rights on art history books as members of Yoakum's Ozarks Black community? Do these other stories have any relevance to the life of a famous artist who made all of his work and was part of an arts community on the south side of Chicago? Would there be any more validity or authenticity if these histories interviewed someone like my dad? I'm using these stories to frame out a concrete example of differing conceptions of memorialization, archives, and the historical subject. To me, they also bring up a question I have had to baldly ask in planning meetings around archival collections, and will candidly say I have generally not received direct answers to. When I hear colleagues say, "We need to share out our work with the community," the boundaries are rarely obvious. I do not do a lot of work in local history or community archives. But when I ask, "Who do you mean by the community?" I'm no longer surprised when it's treated not like an actual question, but like some sort of rhetorical accusation. This comes from people outside of a marginalized group feeling some balance of guilt and responsibility and fear to the people represented in their archival work. And on their own, those aren't necessarily the worst ways to feel when tasked with the heavy burden of preserving and disseminating someone else's history. As a swirl of emotions, however, they create a homogenized vision of a community that can validate the work, an idea that there is a group of people with a shared regional or ethnic background that will have a uniform, effective response when presented with that history, and whose response can then validate all choices made in that archival work. Community is a blunt tool for a subtle job. I have often said, as an acerbic aside, during those meetings, "Oh, when they say we should crowdsource so the community can have more power over description," or "we need to have answers because the community will potentially call us out," that when people say the community, what they mean is Black people. I say it acerbically, both out of frustration at dancing around the obvious, but also at the idea that there exists for every collection of Black archives a distinct and definable community. This is a picture of Lloyd Yoakum and Charles Berry. Charles whose name I only learned fairly recently, as he passed far before I was born, and everyone my whole life has just referred to him as Junior, is standing in front of the car, and Lloyd is hanging out on top. I only know this because my father told me, and if this photo was out of our family's possession, it would quickly become two African American men with a car circa 1950s. One man is leaning against the car and the other is seated on the car's roof. This is a ballpoint pen and watercolor drawing circa 1965 to 1966 by Joseph Yoakum, titled Sac River, Ash Grove, Missouri. It's currently housed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. If that photo was taken either near the Yoakum or Berry homes, then it would have been a quick drive down to Lowwater Bridge, which is over the Sac River in Ash Grove. I only know this because I grew up in that house and occasionally walked down there with friends to cool off in the summer. Memory, of course, is fraught. I remember the Sac River in Ash Grove, but Yoakum might have been remembering the Little Sac River, which is a bit of a ways between Ash Grove and Springfield that served as a community swimming spot when the pools were still segregated. The Sac River I remember might have been different than that one because they dammed the river in 1969 to build Stockton Lake, but I don't know how that affected the water flow. Any river any of us remember is separate and unique waterway, of course, because it is filtered between our own minds and received histories and personal experiences. And the topic I said I was going to talk about at the beginning of this was how to respect historical subjects as living beings. The type of respect I'm interested in growing in this field is that comes from a place of self-awareness, awareness of flaws. How do we take pride in our work preserving the past and advocate for its importance, while balancing that with the awareness that the history we can preserve is completely incomplete? Respecting historical subjects in our archives is in many ways identical to respecting contemporary people in our lives, treating them with dignity, acknowledging shared humanity. In contemporary contexts, we often have the benefit of shared cultural understandings, but when we move into the past, those understandings become more and more opaque. Every picture on the screen now is a picture that my family has at my parents' house. I can identify some of these figures from things I remember being told by my dad, whose memory is quixotic, and some of the figures I have already known I have misrepresented in other contexts. But as it moves forward, I am the only person other than my dad who has any knowledge of who the people in these photos are and who has the ability to preserve that. In spite of these differing conceptions of memory that I think are really key to respecting different people's humanity, I am not suggesting a turn towards sort of extreme anti-presentism or an apologetic of the he was a man of his times variety, but rather towards a sort of ethnographic empathy for people whose memory we are tasked with making discoverable. Especially when working with people who are marginalized in their own times, there is a duty to remember that for each person represented in an archive, be it in a single letter or in a suitcase full of poems, they were so much more than the paper that they left behind. Thank you. I think that was much shorter than it was supposed to be, but packed a punch, and now we can have Q&A.
Started at least 8 minutes late. This is great.
Put that as part of my speaking time.
So, questions?
I'll even open up the chat in case they have questions.
Oh,
I have a question about, well, first of all, thank you for this talk. It was really amazing because I am always curious about museum evidence relative to my research. And I'm wondering, when you said that you were wondering what should and shouldn't be shared for public consumption, I'm curious about what you think about museums having to, if I understand this correctly, if you take on a collection, you're committing to like caring for it in perpetuity, right? And so I don't know if that's true or not. That's what someone told me when I was talking to a museum curator. But I'm curious about what that means, because like for if you're preserving a group of marginalized people's items that they may or may not even have wanted to preserve, I think that's very different than preserving like, I don't know, Frederick Douglass's papers. He's like, I'm important and you should remember me. And I'm curious, especially considering that museums are so not friendly to marginalized people historically, and what does that mean for you, and how do you interpret that when we want to preserve these stories, we as like collective, but also like how would these people have felt? How should we do it? I'm just a little more curious about
Yeah. I mean, I guess I can think of this in two parts. Perpetuity is I'm gonna shift this way so you can, it feels weird. Well, tilt this down a little bit. Perpetuity is a weird concept in the idea of preservation because it's meaningless. Because you can't make a promise to do something for an amount of time that you don't know what it is. And it also can be used as an excuse to not do certain things. If I need to preserve this for perpetuity, maybe then people can't see it because it would be damaged by light and touching.
I have to put this up just because otherwise the view is very odd from Zoom.
I think the screen is still shared.
Yes, but the camera's on, so I could turn the camera off.
Sure.
And then we can do this.
Yeah, I'm just too little.
There we go.
But so that's what I always sort of bristle against. It's like, because there's no definitions around it. It's just a generalized thing. Like what we're doing is preserving this for the future. And then you're like, that's wild. It takes so much electricity to preserve stuff for the future. Have you heard about what's happening with the future? Yikes. But on the other hand, these sort of questions about like interpretation over time is one of those things where I have feelings about respecting people as fully human, which to me means acknowledging that they are as human as I am currently, and not like, and that is both, that's like a cosmological way I feel. It's not necessarily something I could say should be codified across the board. There are arguments one could make of like, if a person is dead, then their materials that are left behind really only exist to edify people that are alive, because those guys are dead. I say that in a way that maybe doesn't sound like an appealing argument, but I've heard people that believe that make it more appealing. And I don't know that I would say, like, to me, that's wrong, but it's not wrong in a way I can point out the flaw when I don't get into something like, well, I believe this about humans. So that gets a little tricky, but even on the light end, something that I do bristle at that comes up a lot in archives and museums is that regardless of if you're saying like, we should keep these private because this person didn't want them to be shared, or if I was saying, you know, with that hypothetical of if this suitcase full of poems is like, we have no connection to anything, and you say, I'm going to share this because people need to know about the creativity of Black women in the 1960s. And from what I'm piecing together here, she was having all these difficulties, and these poems have different themes around religion, but also around death. It's very, that's powerful for me, and I want to share that with other Black women so they can learn about themselves. That is a different way of respecting that I'm not saying is invalid. When things get to more of the truly shifty areas for me are when we look at historical figures who were making, and this gets into what I said, I'm not trying to be anti, like, super saying you shouldn't be presentist, because that was a big issue, American Historical, like last year, but it's important to remember that people existed in the worlds they existed in. And I always think of this example when I was at a different institution, and they had a lot of collections about social organizations at the turn of the 20th century. And someone was giving a presentation on this collection and shared about, you know, a letter they had found where a young man had written to a social organization that did these sorts of advising and was really concerned. It was like a fraught letter, full of emotion, because he could not stop masturbating. And that was like super funny because people left, because that's like a funny thing. It's also not at all a funny thing, because that's a very reasonable thing for him to have been concerned about based on the medical advice he would have been given at his time. And for me, like, I got really steamed because I was joking about this talk with someone else, a friend of mine,
who is super Tibetan Buddhist. One of his big things is the concept of like everyone who is alive. Like everyone has been your mother and you've been everyone's mother. I don't believe that. But that sort of conceptualization of me of like, that guy was just being a guy who was alive. And he was upset because he thought something was wrong with him. And he didn't make that up. And he wrote like, that's definitely a private letter. And I get that we're all laughing because that's hilarious. We live in the future where we don't think this sort of thing, apparently. But that sort of relationship to historical figures, I think, is where things get really shady, which again, that's why I'm saying at the end, this complication of like, but that doesn't mean you would say, well, I mean, if this guy's from the South and he has money and he's white at the time, of course he will own slaves. But the reason why that's not an equivalent is because other people made different choices of the same class, of the same standing. People at the time of the 1900s had different feelings about onanism, but probably not the same like middle class, like working class guy who was trying to be a certain type of Protestant in his community. But it is like perpetuity and the ideas of how do you represent people from the past, I do feel like is more personal than institutions would like to claim that their work is.
So I'm going to ask your questions, but and if folks have questions in the room, I'm going to step up to the mic. Unfortunately, we don't have a mic to circulate.
Oh,
so
I can repeat people's questions.
Yeah, so we can, okay, if you can repeat questions, that'd be great.
Are there, and also, if there's questions on Teams, chat, Zoom, I'm not seeing them.
So there's a first question in the chat. I'll let that go first before asking the question. Oh, so what is the plan for the suitcases feature?
Oh, I don't have a plan. I'm just going to take it back. We have a lot of stuff at my parents' house. I'll eventually have to figure it out. They live in the farm that my great-great-great-great-grandparents built. William Berry and Caroline Boone Berry in 1872. Technically, that house is now co-owned by my brother and me because of how state-funded insurance works in our country. But eventually, I'll have to make some sorts of decisions. Maybe I'll put them all in my new house, like in another house I have. As such, this is antithetical to what I do in the professional world, theoretically, but I don't know that people need to have this stuff. It's my family stuff. Other people in my family can see it. But if I'm not going, yeah. My dad for a long time ran a regional history museum of African Americans in the Ozarks, and it was a labor of love, and it was a lot of work. And that was good for him.
I'll take another question from the live room.
Yeah, we go back and forth.
Yeah, we'll go back and forth.
I was wondering, so it's not a statement, but it's a question.
Sure.
And I'm thinking about, I can't get the in the question.
Sure.
But I'm thinking about curation, and I'm thinking about a project I've been working on for years in the Octavia Butler Manuscript Archives. And to be clear, I'm not an archivist nor historian or anything else, which is relevant to this. So I hit a place where I realized I really need to pull back, just psychologically for myself. I wasn't sure how to proceed. And I had people to ask and talk about it, but just the level of personal response to the archive. Because in case you don't know, part of that archive is that she had promised to give it to the Huntington. I built a really great relationship with the curator, the whole thing. I interviewed her, talked to her, the whole thing, but then died suddenly and unexpected.
Yeah.
And so, the museum, the library did a great job, beautiful job, of course, with, sort of finding aid and organization and, all the things, right? But because she had died so suddenly, there was another level of curation that we know she was sort of expecting to be able to do before the papers became her archive. She died young, and we just going to imagine she had another 30 years or whatever, you know what I mean? And so now the way it's been sort of handled, it's actually not a critique, it's just a thing I had been thinking, is that all the stuff is just kind of there. So personal diaries, At some points in the diaries, I really like, I'm so glad I can talk to you, diary, because no one will ever see it. And I'm like, oh shit, you know? And so I was just wondering, sort of as a working sort of curator and archivist, just if you have a sense of for yourself, just how do you navigate those kinds of moments? Because, you know, the moment when she died, and I'm a little bitchy about this, but it definitely set off with great new, you know, interest in the person who'd been around a long time. We'll say someone became very popular. And so there was such almost a sort of land grab around this sense of like, we're gonna find all these things about this person who's so interesting. There's a person who premised so much of her life on privacy. So I guess if this were to form a question, the question is simply, how do you navigate between what are usually reasonable expectations of privacy against the kinds of work or things you want to come out of archives all the time?
Yeah. So this is a question about privacy and about what happens when people don't necessarily get the ability to use their own discretion about what goes into an archive, and focusing on Octavia Butler and her relationship with the Huntington Library. There's like a very practical part of me that says that this was an issue with their donor agreement. Because initially in the donor agreement, whenever that was made, if you wanted to have some sort of future discretion about what goes into the collection, that's one thing. But you could, like, they should have checked early on, or someone should have advised her.
Some big obvious things.
Yeah, but it's something like diary. Like there's,
Yeah.
in a world where you have a better, more responsive donor agreement conversation, something like that should preferably come up. On the other hand, having seen a lot of collections, a few collections from like pretty famous people, even if you have the time to go through it, maybe diaries you catch, but there's so much paper. And so things that get left behind sometimes are very meaningful, or it's just actually funny. When at Harvard, we had the Gore Vidal collection, just so much paper, and they had gone to his house many times, the curator, and talked with him about things, about what he wanted to give or not. And so, but we would still find things that were just sort of like, this is silly. Oh, a card, it's a birthday card from Wes Anderson. And I was just like, oh, but that's a cool card. And it wasn't. It was a boring card. Or something that's just like, there was a letter from Sting's manager asking Gore Vidal to check out Sting's new record of lute music. Yeah, exactly. What? But like, so these are like both innocuous things that you wouldn't say like, I take them, sure. But at the same time, if you are someone who was like, I want to think about my corpus, you're probably not thinking that. So there's like a very practical part of me that's like, that's just donor agreement with a living donor that should have been done better. On the flip side, that's a contemporary person who we may feel like way more contemporary relationship with. But a ton of what is doing primary source research is reading something that someone at the time was like, you know, dearest diary, 1742, I have complicated feelings. And then those things, like part of what work of historians is looking at that and then making a claim, and maybe that claim is really grounded, or sometimes it's like somebody wrote once in their diary that their friend Steve was handsome, and now this is like the most important book about queer 1600s people. But maybe Steve was just really good looking and everybody knew, I don't know. Or maybe he was in love with Steve. Both possibilities. Weird that his name is Steve and it's the 16th century and the other guy had a diary. But these are all things that are possible. And I think that in terms of like your effective response of being like, oh, I'm definitely not supposed to read this. As a researcher, to me, that's more about your personal self-care, about like if it's something maybe disturbing that's clearly personal, or if it's just regular personal, and also how you integrate that into your work, which maybe involves acknowledging that this is uncomfortable and this is why you think it's uncomfortable, because you would assume she would not have let this go into the collection. On the other hand, because she's dead, I don't know. Maybe she would have been like, I've been private this whole time, donezo. Make sure nobody talks to me, but you can read whatever you want. I mean, even giving it to the Huntington is like a complicated interest, is like a decision around publicness. Like in a weird way, because that is technically publicly accessible, but it's a unique institution that has some rules.
Shall we see who's next in the chat.
Are there more up there? I don't know.
Yeah, let's see. Okay, so I think this is the next one. And if I just read
Sure,
this
let me see.
out.
Okay, this is a question from someone named Lorna Peterson, and they're saying that they have been working, to preserve the memory of the May 14th, 2022 massacre at Top Supermarket in Buffalo, New York, and that they're working with a coalition who has spent time on our values, including gaining trust of the impacted community. Any broad general advice you would give of how to approach the community? I feel like that's out of my realm of experience. And I don't know anyone in that community. My reflex is, if that was me, I wouldn't want to talk to people outside of the community about preserving the memory of a thing that was really fresh in my memory. But I don't know them. So I feel like that's, I mean, I appreciate the question, but I don't think I can actually give a useful answer.
Going back first.
So I have a question that kind of goes along with
Sure.
that question. It might be a loaded question
Okay.
that requires a broader answer, but do you think that there's a responsibility for that archivists or curators have the ability to institutionalize empathetic archives, or is that something that's it's just up to personal properties?
Yeah, I don't think you can institutionalize that sort of thing. I feel like because sort of concepts of radical empathy and inclusion and diversity and equity and whatever other words have become key to understandings of cultural heritage fields, that they've attempted to be institutionalized. And I don't know anyone anywhere who has felt satisfied with results. Partially because it is asking to institutionalize and formalize internal stuff. I have often in workplaces sort of pushed back on that and said, like, I don't need my colleagues to understand like me as a Black woman in this moment. I need, if they're describing Black historical materials, for them to do some research so they can appropriately describe that material. And that's actually not based on my feelings. And that goes to things about this sort of idea of like, we should crowdsource with the community. And I always remember, actually came up particularly to memory because Jason Jackson commented on your Facebook post. But an old professor of mine at Indiana talked about, or he had maybe assigned an article. I want to say it was Jason. I'll give it to him. Could have been anyone. I don't remember grad school, but I think it was Jason. About an early project in Alaska around some indigenous museum materials that were digitized and wanting to do a project with local youth to like help crowdsource description. But these were all old museum objects. And so the students, the young people were describing them like shoes, like stuff that my grandma has, because they have expertise on what it's like to be a contemporary person in their communities. They maybe have studied expert, like they could have other knowledge, but the assumption that like, especially when we're talking going further back, that any Black person right now without having done outside research is like, oh yeah, no, I can identify all of these people based on their dress and the timelines and the background of the car. Those are sort of these assumptions that I do think come from this feeling, like it's very feeling stuff, comes from an insecurity of being like, I really shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be the person describing stuff, but also I am not in a position where I can say, like I did to that previous question, oh, I don't think I can answer that. Because this is, I've had that kind of hypothetical a lot with people about different positions when you say like, how did that person end up in that job? And the answer for some of that sort of thing is like, because it's actually a lot of potentially giving up to say, this is a good professional opportunity, but I'm not the one for it. Like, you know, I often use that as like, if someone offered me like, Dorothy, would you like to be the very well-paid director of this new LGBTQ archive? And I would be like, no. That sounds like a great job for someone who knows more about that. But that's a thing I can say because I have a nice job right now. Well, I mean, it's funny, but it's also like, I mean, I would hope I would say that at any point, and I've been making that particular like example for like the last 2 jobs, which are increasingly nicer. But still, it's one of those things where like that is heavy, and it's also heavy because you have to have like a lot of conversations with yourself. Because it's not to say someone who could, we have some curators at NMOC who are not African American and who definitely know more about their subject area than I do, even as a person who studies a lot of Black history. If I had a question about certain things, I would go to them. And that's true across different intersectionalities and things like that, but it does require people to do a lot of internal stuff. That's why I didn't like all those workshops they made us do in 2020 about our feelings at work.
For people on Zoom, there was some vigorous nodding to that last point.
True.
How can the archival community and its professional organizations and institutions further develop a sustainable system to care for and propagate community archives in an ethical and equitable manner? Thanks, James. No pressure.
I mean, I don't feel any pressure because, like I already said, I actually don't do community archives work. I can't make a big statement on it because I don't do that. I feel like partially I've always had, I wish I could only just talk about like 1880 to 1910, maybe 1915. But also I don't feel like I have the skills that I see other people have that succeed in working with different community archives. Because to me, it's also sort of like public librarianship takes different skills than it does to work in special collections. And that's not the cataloging skills, those are people skills. But I guess in sort of idea of how could we further develop sustainable systems, and that's about, I guess I would just say resource allocation. If the idea is that you have one-time funding for things, that's not going to be sustainable. If the idea is that things go into major institutions, that could be sustainable for preservation, but not sustainable for maintaining the concept of a community archive. Also, sustainability is something that has to be driven by said community. And that depends on who's there. Because there are community things that we now call community archives or community centers that hold materials and things like that that have existed for really long times. Some of them had a brief, amazing window. But that's not a thing anyone from the outside could come in and say, like, I'm Dorothy Berry, I have these degrees, and I give a lot of talks, and that's why now that I'm in Detroit, I will help you with your community archive. I don't know anything about Detroit. And I'm only here for a 2-year grant-funded job. But again, I don't work in community archives. People should ask more questions where I'm not just like, I don't know. That's not my bag.
So this is going to start with a news story, but I'm getting to a question.
Sure.
I was on a Zoom call yesterday of stakeholders for the Disability Cultural Center they're trying to build on campus. And at some point during the call, the student affairs, I don't know if she's faculty or staff, the student affairs person who's supposed to be setting all this up said to those of us on the call, pretty much all of whom were disabled in some way, some inspirational thing about you are the people who are going to make this happen. You are the leaders of the cultural center plans, something like that. And I got irritated and stuck my hand up and asked, why do we have to do it? Why are you not having this discussion right now with the university administration, who has the power and influence to determine resource allocation and budgeting and making sure we actually get this to work? Why is this resting on the people that this is supposed to be helping when it's done? Why does the disability community have control of this? And so I'm wondering, do you run into that kind of question or those kind of debates in your work? The question of why do the people in the marginalized community you are trying to protect, preserve, process, exhibit, collect archives from, whatever, why do the people in the marginalized community have to do it? You know, and is there anyone we should be talking to in terms of like power and influence and resources versus just where do we want those, what do we want those resources to be?
Yeah.
Does that make any sense?
No, it does make total sense. Oh, so it's a question around when sort of the balancing of needing assistance or maybe needing some sort of reparative assistance from people that have infrastructure power and monetary power, and how that sometimes can shift onto undue responsibilities onto marginalized people.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, I definitely have heard similar things. And whenever someone says something to me that's like, you are the people that are leading us, you're the voices we want to hear, I just ignore that because that's a thing people say. And I don't mean to say that you should have ignored it in that moment. What I mean to say is, it's nonsense. Like, it doesn't have any deep meaning, because if that is true, then you would be able to say, okay, great, I don't want to talk to you anymore. Let's talk to the president. Because if you're actually leading, then if I have all this power, let me have it. And it's also a way of shifting responsibility onto you all, because then if it's not successful, you have been the leaders of this. We gave you the power, not the power of the purse, but just vibe-based power to do this whole thing. And that, I think that is not an uncommon sort of thing to be more generous. I think that there's a version of people saying that where what they mean to say is, I want you to be heard because I know that we don't necessarily have a full understanding of the things you would experience and value. I think that generally that actually is what people think they're saying. Because I'm very Pollyanna-ish, and I do think people are trying to be nice. Which, that's one of those things that's like, that's a thing I think, but is it valid? Who knows? But it does come up, and usually in those situations, I guess now my responses now are different than they would have been at the stage when I was in school, even advanced school. Because I've now done these things enough that I have more experience in having freaked out at people and decided that that didn't get me the result I wanted, or that it was too much emotional work for me. And am now better at sort of very calmly, and as I have heard from others, potentially terrifyingly, have a response. So part of me is just sort of like, advocacy work in which you need to participate with people who do not understand what you're advocating for is always difficult. And it is difficult also to measure within yourself how much difficulty you can handle. I definitely, at earlier stages, have taken on too much emotional work as part of the work that I'm doing, and then been like, I'm having an extreme freak out, I'm crying, I'm having this experience because I just did all this work about Black elections, and then this white lady, ellipses, just fill in brackets, ellipses, whatever we want to say. And so that's just sort of like a thing over time. But I do think if you feel like, and this is like my more opinion based, but I feel like, I guess everything has been, I have a fact book back here, but it feels like if that's a concern you have, that's going to be sort of like a head patting type of situation, which I think is like a type of paternalism that is particularly something people like to inflict on people with disabilities. That if you have not already, as a group, there could be benefits of really like doing some non-meeting with them planning about structural type of things that you need, and sort of next time it's like, what would you dream of in the space, and being like, well, actually these are our demands. And then they might be like, oh, we're not at demands point, and you might go, oh, we are, so how do we meet in the mid, like what? And I don't, that's a lot of like organizing type work is difficult, and that takes strategy, and that takes a lot of spoons, but sometimes that's necessary, especially when you're negotiating with like any sort of big administrative structures like universities have. Because also at the end of the day, whatever they need to do for Disability Center, there's also probably things they legally have to do. And there's also potentially things that they don't know they legally have to do, but they do legally have to do.
And so, yeah, but I do think this is the sort of advocacy work is laborious and does take stuff out of you. So I am sorry that that happened in that meeting, because that is not a great experience. And I think it's awesome that you raised your hand and was like, no. So here's a question. Can you say more about what you mean when you say ethnographic empathy? What I mean is I love alliterations. That was the initial desire of that. But what I actually mean is that an ethnographic, like especially with historical figures, doing as much, and this is more on the research end or writing end than the work of a processing archivist who does not have the resource allocation to necessarily dig this deeply. But trying to understand as much as you can the full context of historical figures that you are discussing, because it's everything you view is through your own lens, and it's really hard for us to not, it's hard for us to both not put in our contemporary understanding of experience into someone from the past, and at the same time, it's hard to not be so afraid of doing that that you don't allow historical people to exist in 3 dimensions. And sometimes that's on a very practical level. I always think of the, so Naomi Wolf, who wrote a history book that got really slammed. I feel like it was. But she wrote a book about homosexuality in early, I want to say it's actually 19th century England. And the book made the claim that a lot of people were actually put to death because of like being tried for male on male sexual activity. And in a true rare moment of gotcha journalism, she was interviewed by the BBC, and the interviewer just like had done more research in a different way. And the issue was that there is a crime called sodomy in this time period, and I guess in some parts of America right now, but like in this time period. And there was a thing in the like law books, the clerk judge books, that said something around the lines of like executed or sent to death, something like that. And both of those terms, sodomy, and I'll go with executed, I don't think that's the exact term from the book, but it's analogous enough. Those are 2 terms that I feel like most of us could say, yes, that's a clear language, I know what the definition of those things are. And so she was like, I have these cases. And then the guy on the BBC who was interviewing her was like, well, sodomy just means anything that's not like heterosexual missionary sex, legally speaking, at that time. So some people that were sent to jail for sodomy they also meant bestiality. They also could have meant a lot of things, not all gay people. But then also the real kicker was that the word that she thought meant people were given like a death sentence actually was the phrasing that they used to mean that the case was over. So it could just mean released from jail, or we don't deal with this person anymore. And it's a good example. I mean, it's like the gotcha journalism part is pretty wild. You do feel like there's no one editing this, all that sort of thing. But as an example, I think it's useful because without doing deeper study, it's really easy to assume like this part I know, this word I know what it means at this time. I understand enough context to pull this together. And that's, it's a thing that's difficult to be able to assume because things change really quickly, and things that are, so from that book, it's a great book called The Great Cat Massacre. And one of the lines in the introduction says, things that were transparent to our ancestors become very opaque to us. And so it's this sort of thing of there are things you wouldn't think you need to mention because everyone knows what that is. And that's the same in our lives right now. There are things you don't define when you're talking to friends because we all have you have a shared cultural understanding with them. But when you're going back, it feels like 100 Victorian times, which is actually much more than 100 years now because time keeps moving forward. Yikes. But like, you feel like you go back 150 years. Of course, I'm aware that that's very different than my life now. But also, you go back like 40 years, you don't understand the shared language necessarily without doing a ton of research. And regional research. Like, ask if you have 2 older people from 2 different parts of the country, what's this piece of candy called? Totally different things. I remember when my mom said they were called Boston baked beans, and my dad was like, "You sound wild." They were definitely never called that. They were called this crazy racist thing. And she was like, "Not in Brooklyn they were. We just called them Boston baked beans." And he was like, "No, no, everyone called them this incredibly racist name." And that's true for both of them. But if I read something that somebody in Brooklyn at that time called them the very racist name, then I wrote, "In Brooklyn, they called them this." So that sort of ethnographic idea for me is sort of trying to get as much full understanding of people before I'm really getting into a description of the person as a whole.
All right, perhaps we can take one more question from the floor.
Well, we could take, we do the Q&A, we don't have to put it all online.
Well, I'll leave that up to y'all. I just so my question is kind of, you talk a lot about how you define that music is not community archives, but also the sort of lines you've had to draw about feelings in the workplace, both for yourself and for your collections. And this is something that I have been thinking a lot about, and friends of mine, colleagues of mine, because we don't want to work in community archives because we know ourselves and we understand that that sort of emotional labor is not for us. And also, we're all white women, we're like, the community archives are a good word or not, and that's a good word, but we don't need to be professionally involved in that. But we keep finding ourselves sort of like put in situations where we're struggling to define like where the value of that emotional labor stops when you're outside of the community archives. So you kind of touched on it a few times. I was wondering like your experiences, if you're comfortable with that, or just like general like professional guidelines for archives.
Could you clarify a little more what you're asking? I'm not sure I understand the question fully.
Like, when you say you work in special collections,
Sure.
you're not working in community archives, and you have found that the emotional labor that comes with community archives is not something that is necessarily valued to use as a professional in special collections. I was just wondering if you could elaborate.
Sure, I guess I more mean I don't have the skills I've seen in other people. Not that they're not valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But that they come up less. Like I know people that have done different works around maybe AIDS in certain communities, and that work involves stuff like driving people to the grocery store, even though they're doing an archives job, because if you're actually working with a community and especially trying to gain senses of like equal trust, that has to be reciprocal. And I am a good performer, but I'm actually introverted. And I'm not like, I can do a thing of talking to people, but I'm not actually that good at that type of thing. So that's more, it's not that it's less that I don't think that type of work, yeah, it has tons of value. I just don't have skills for it, is really what I mean. But I don't feel like that is an answer to what you're actually asking.
No, I'm asking more like, because I agree that has a lot of value. Like I could do it for my friends, but
Sure.
do that in my professional life, like I wouldn't be able to sustain it.
Yeah.
And to be able to communicate that to people, like, well, I like special collections because that's not necessarily the name of that job. Like, how do you set those boundaries?
Oh, like professionally?
Yes.
Well then, in that case, I feel like it moves into sort of more of just how do you sell yourself to a job?
Mm-hmm.
And I would just focus more on your other strengths. Like, you know, for any job, it's not great to be like, here's a thing I'm bad at. People do it a lot. I mean, like it feels like a thing that should be useful. But it's more sort of like, this is getting like very career-y, like, how many hours at the reference desk do people in this processing archives position have to do? Probably some, but maybe you don't want to do 16 hours over the week, you know. I feel like that's that's a general sort of way you can phrase just to get the vibe of an institution. And then also, as you did identify as a white woman, a big issue is not volunteering for all the emotional labor that they would like women to do as part of the workplace to keep the coffee machines running and to keep the meeting notes being taken and to make sure someone scheduled this meeting. Like that, which is like a general femmes across the board. Don't let yourself become the mom of your department. They're gonna want you to.
That part I am good at, of course, but
Well, that's, I mean, I've known so many people for whom that is true, because some of the detail-oriented work that might make like special collections appealing also means you probably are really good at taking notes. And so sometimes you do have to say, I can't take notes. Or just decide that, like, I will take notes because I don't trust these people. They don't do good notes. But you know, sort of those internal things. But I feel like, to me, always beneficial to think about things that you're very good at and that you'd like to pursue, more so than the things that you're less good at, because you can develop more skills or shift how you think about your skills. Like, it's funny that I do a lot of public speaking, but it makes sense because I also studied music performance. Like, that's my background. And I think of everything as just like, this is performance. People don't actually know who I am. Even if I do something super personal and talk about my family, no one knows anything about my family. And that's okay, like, you know, that sort of thing. But that's what I would say. It's just like, if you really want to process, or you really want to do virtual reference, I would just sell myself as someone who's amazing at doing virtual reference and has developed some pretty unique skills in that, because since the pandemic, like, that's a thing you could say. Just don't go ahead and say, like, I don't want to talk to people, because because the issue is that library already has so many people who don't want to talk to people. And that they will interpret you saying, I don't want to talk to people, as I can't, which is a lot of people that work at a lot of libraries. There's a big difference between just like, this isn't my really favorite thing, but I could probably do reference in a quiet room, and like, this lady is so mean to everyone who comes into the reading room. Doesn't want to give them papers. Those people also exist. So, you know, and I've seen on other scales sort of things that you could say that feel normal self-deprecating, don't always, like, people in an interview don't know you. So when you say, like, if I was to say I'm introverted and someone didn't know that I do all this stuff, they'd be like, oh, this job actually does have some public speaking, so she might not be a strong candidate. And that's true, really. I feel like that sort of stuff is true across the board for jobs. Sell your good things and keep your bad things in your own head. So you can know if a job is good for you, but you don't have to let them know. They should leave thinking you're the best.
All right, on that happy note, I think we probably have to end. Thank you again to you all for coming, and thanks to Argue, Myth, iSchool for this event, and thank you, Dorothy, for being here.